1955, a year of anxiety and triumph. A major medical hurdle was crossed with the discovery by Dr. Jonas Salk of the anti-polio vaccine, which was to spread a mantle of protection over millions of American children. And the scientist entered the ranks of the medical immortals.
But what was polio, and how did it affect our nation?
Almost everybody knew some family that had been stricken by polio.
And why did Jonas Salk succeed where others had failed?
But it was amazing because this polio epidemic just went like that.
In 1894, the first major polio epidemic broke out in the United States, but it was not the last. In the first half of the 20th century, this devastating virus, also known as infantile paralysis or poliomyelitis, struck again and again, especially in crowded urban centers, paralyzing or even killing its victims, who were primarily children.
Also, polio, because of its nature, is what we term an equal opportunity disease. It's not an issue of race, ethnicity, wealth, education. Everybody was fair game.
Polio struck very quickly. A child could go to sleep one night perfectly healthy and then wake up the next morning unable to sit up or move their legs. It was also much more prevalent during the summertime.
But at that time, polio, which was called the summer disease, was the bane of parents from midsummer into September. They kept kids away, their children away, from swimming pools, from places of amusement. Literally, they would quarantine them in their homes for fear that their child would get this disease.
In some of the more severe cases of polio, the virus would attack the lungs, so the patient would have to be put into a machine called the iron lung.
And one of the girls I was at school with, she did contract polio. Well, several people contracted it, but one of them contracted it very seriously. At the age of 15, she was paralyzed from the neck down. And I do remember the iron lung machines, and some people who were paralyzed, they were paralyzed all over them. So they had to go in the iron lung machine even to breathe. It was a terrible disease. It really was a terrible disease.
When an iron lung was not necessary, a paralysis patient would get a brace or a wheelchair for support.
And it was very difficult to walk for me. And at that time, I used to walk around on my hands and knees because I still hadn't been fitted with a brace.
The fact that the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, developed late-stage polio shows how far up the ladder this disease could strike.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a very popular president who served the nation from 1933 to 1945. FDR contracted polio as an adult in 1921 and was paralyzed from the waist down, though he rarely permitted himself to be photographed in his wheelchair for fear that it might be perceived as a weakness. Roosevelt founded the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, otherwise known as the March of Dimes, which collected dimes from people to donate to polio research. In his honor, an image of FDR is on the U.S. dime. The polio vaccine may never have been discovered if not for Roosevelt and the March of Dimes. The main reason, however, that a preventive for polio was found was because of one man. Jonas Salk was born in New York City on October 28, 1914, to Dora and Daniel Salk. He had two younger brothers, Lee and Herman. His parents were Jewish immigrants from Russia, and his father worked in the garment industry. Even though Salk's parents didn't have much formal education, they had a strong belief in academic achievement and encouraged Jonas and his siblings to succeed.
As a child, I was not interested in science. I was really interested in things human. If you like, the human side of nature.
Though Jonas Salk may not have been interested in science as a child, he still did very well in school. He graduated from the Townsend Harris High School, a school for gifted students, and entered the City College of New York at age 16, planning to study law. After taking a science class out of curiosity, however, he became hooked. Salk continued on to medical school at New York University, graduating in 1939. In the 1940s, he studied influenza at the University of Michigan. This work laid a foundation for his later research on the poliovirus. In 1947, Jonas Salk was hired by the University of Pittsburgh.
Within a few months after I arrived in Pittsburgh, I was visited by the director of the research of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, asking if I would be willing to participate in a program on typing polioviruses. Well, I'd had no experience in working with polio, but this provided me with an opportunity, just as the work on influenza did. And so I seized upon that opportunity. It gave me a chance to get funds, to get laboratory facilities, to get equipment, to hire staff, and to build up something that was not there.
What he built was the Salk Virus Research Laboratory, from which the polio vaccine that the whole world was waiting for would emerge. Of course, there were problems.
But you're not naturally immune to polio, so you need a certain level of stimulus, but you don't want too much.
Salk was the first person to conceive the idea of using a killed virus in a vaccine. All other vaccines, including the polio vaccine later developed by Salk's main scientific rival, Albert Sabin, used live viruses, but this put the recipients at risk of catching the disease trying to be prevented. Salk started to work on a polio vaccine, using a killed virus.
And he developed in 1951, using laboratory monkeys, what he perceived to be an effective preventive for polio.
In 1952, Salk tested his vaccine on children who had already gotten polio but had recovered. When the children developed stronger antibodies in response to the vaccine, he moved on to testing himself, his wife, his colleagues, and even his own children. Nobody got sick. 1954 marked the beginning of the largest medical experiment in history, involving 1.8 million schoolchildren, millions of whom received either placebo or no vaccine, while 440,000 received Salk's polio vaccine. The results, announced on April 12, 1955, the 10th anniversary of Franklin D. Roosevelt's death, were dramatic. The vaccine worked, and the vaccinated children have been given strong immunity against polio. Overnight, Jonas Salk became a national hero. The March of Dimes promoted a widespread immunization campaign, and the annual number of polio cases dropped very quickly. By 1961, only 161 cases were reported in the United States. By 1979, polio was eliminated from the United States and from the Western Hemisphere in 1991.
By the time I left school and then I got married, Jonas Salk had just come out with his polio vaccine. And I had a little boy, a baby, and I rushed him down to get this first shot.
What were the character traits that led to Jonas Salk's success?
Perseverance, never losing focus on what he wanted to accomplish, sometimes at all cost, but still pushing his agenda forward. He was not going to be distracted. He was not going to be told that he was not going to succeed. He knew he was going to succeed.
Although he died in 1995, Jonas Salk's legacy still lives on in the form of the countless millions of children whose future he safeguarded from polio. Though we have moved from the 20th century into the 21st century, global viruses pose a bigger threat than ever, and successful vaccines are extremely rare. Jonas Salk's remarkable achievement still stands as a beacon of hope and inspiration for all of us today.